Who am I?
I'm Spider-Man.
These videos are not for children. If you're a children, then piss off.
Hey there, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso. And you guys asked me to go into the Spider-Verse. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. And I'm gonna start in a pretty surprising way. No, the title isn't clickbait. There was in fact a Spider-Man TV series connected to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. Or at least the first one.
Are you serious?
Now I've spoke about the show before briefly, and I'd highly recommend checking that video out before this one. This way you get the full picture on things. There's some information I covered in that one that I'm not necessarily going to be rehashing here, so go ahead, go on and check that out, and then come back here when you're done. We'll all wait.
A Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web.
Good? Alright, sweet. This series was made in an effort to follow the brand new, ultra-successful Spider-Man movie that had just come out at the time. A fact the show went out of its way to try to acknowledge every chance it got. Whether it was the opening credits using the movie's font, or the fact that Spidey doesn't use web cartridges and shoots organic webs out of his wrists, something that was only present in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, or the fact that Mary Jane is more interested in being an actress rather than a model, not to mention that there's countless references to that first movie. At random intervals, Mary Jane and Spider-Man will reference their classic kiss. It's done on more than one occasion. Whereas in the second film, Harry was now living at his father's place, and Pete had his own apartment, in this show, Harry and Peter are roommates. Because, yeah, that was the case in the first movie. And Harry is constantly complaining about Spider-Man and blaming him for his father's death.
It's all there, black and white, clear as crystal.
But I think the reason the show brought up its canon so often is because you'd have no way of knowing otherwise. These characters don't look like the same ones from the Raimiverse. They don't act like the same characters from the Raimiverse. They don't seem like the same characters from the Raimiverse. Through no reasonable stretch of the imagination can you watch this and believe it has any sort of legitimate connection to the original movie. It's impossible. The show also came out in between the release of the first movie and the making of the second. So despite following the continuity of the first film, the production was oblivious to plans for the second one. Let alone the third one that was further down the way. Let's not even go there. So this whole thing is kind of like an alternate reality. We're talking about somewhere in the multiverse, there is a universe that goes Spider-Man 1, Spider-Man the new animated series, and that's it. That's the whole canon.
I feel like we're trapped in some kind of alternate universe.
But outside of its constant canon fodder, if I had to use one word to describe Spider-Man the new animated series, it would be ambitious. And, ambitious to ridiculous and commendable levels. This was before we got the superhero team-ups and crossovers that we're so used to today. I'm not saying that these things didn't happen at the time, I'm just saying that they happened far less than they do now. And in a short time, this series managed to do a whole lot. In a lot of other Spider-Man shows, crossovers happen less frequently. And they're considered a huge deal, almost as if this was the colliding of two worlds. But here, it gives you the feel of being one big universe where these characters interacting isn't really all that rare. In the span of 13 episodes, the show has Spider-Man interact with all different heroes and villains in the Marvel Universe. In the very second episode of the series, Kingpin from the Daredevil movie shows up. And yeah, sure, it's kinda dopey that they decided to turn him into J. Wellington Wimpy, but it's still impressive. In the third episode, we see Dr. Connor's transformation into the Lizard. It's a mostly faithful telling of the tale, even if it does kind of fast forward through everything. I feel like I'm watching this on 2x speed. In episode 8, we're shown the tragic tale of Peter's friend Max Dillon. And we watch as he's bullied and hazed into becoming Electro. And by the way, real quick, this version of the character is just as much sympathetic as he is scary. I mean, here, this guy is pretty much nightmare fuel. From appearance, to his voice, to his intentions. I'm sorry, but Stalker and superpowers aren't something I want to see go hand in hand. And shockingly enough, Electro is actually the only villain to make a return to the show following his first appearance. In future episodes, we're also shown the likes of Kraven the Hunter and Silver Sable. Silver Sable, who, at the time, I don't think I'd ever seen in anything but a comic book before this. And with shows not showcasing characters that we already know and love, and some that we don't necessarily know but will come to love because of their interpretations on the show, they're creating a whole slew of original characters. But the interesting thing here is that the original characters the show creates aren't really all that original. A lot of these new faces are old names repurposed. A lot of the custom characters are essentially just replacements for other big Marvel names. In the first episode, we're introduced to Turbojet, who is really just an amalgamation of Rocket Racer and Blue Streak. A few episodes later, we're shown a sword-wielding, honorable female ninja named Shikata, who is obviously this world's Elektra. But the most obvious, I think, is Talon, who is very clearly, I don't know, let's be nice and say inspired by the Black Cat. There could even be a case made for this guy over here, Sergei, as being their take on the Vulture. The finale also introduces us to a villainous pair of twins. Twins with powers to rival Professor X. A pair which I believe to be a combination of the Frost Sisters and Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. Then there's Peter's other love interest, Indy, a big-time news reporter, who seems to be a polymerization of Gwen Stacy, Liz Allen, and Betty Brant. And I have to compliment the show here, because all of these characters fit right in place with the rest of the world the show sets up. As a matter of fact, I'd say their integration is pretty flawless. When this show first came out, I was under the impression that all of these characters were actual characters from comics I'd never read. So I give the show credit for creating characters who blend seamlessly into an already established continuity. However, I question why they went through the trouble of creating so many characters based on other characters, when simply just using the original characters would have probably attracted more attention, and been more appreciated by fans. Unless, of course, they weren't allowed to use certain characters, as has been the case with other shows, and this was their unique way of working around it. You know, the good old Gotham Joker trick. The show has an interesting take on its characters and the world of Spider-Man. Neil Patrick Harris nails it as Spider-Man, and he is still to this day one of my all-time favorite Spider-Men. He's just so natural in the role and gives a solid performance both as Spider-Man and as Peter Parker. He seems like a young adult with the weight of the world on his shoulders, juggling girl problems and whatever new threat is terrorizing the city. He has the perfect voice for a role like this. And while I can definitely recognize that this is in fact Neil Patrick Harris, I only hear Spider-Man. He's very authentic and believable in both sides of the role. As Spider-Man, he's charismatic and occasionally charming even. He's fun, he's friendly. Unless you're putting someone else in danger, then he's not such a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And not to mention, he's quippy. This Spider-Man spends the runtime cracking jokes on those he comes up against and terrorizing terrorists. As Peter, he's an earnest, honest dude trying to get by and do the best that he can. He's constantly burdened not only by his day-to-day responsibilities, but also by the great power that Spider-Man brings. There is so much about this show that I love. So much about this show that just got Spider-Man. The constant leaving friends, family, and loved ones at random intervals, accidentally letting down the people closest to you to the point that he almost pushes them away entirely. The inability to climb up the ladder at work because he's too busy climbing up buildings. This is Spider-Man. There's a scene in the show where Peter gets his ass kicked, for no other reason than if he fought back properly, he runs the risk of exposing his secret identity. That is what Spider-Man is all about. Spider-Man, for as much of a relief as he is to the rest of the city, is a complete burden to Peter Parker. Crime fighting gets in the way of his social life, in the way of his love life, in the way of his career. He's constantly just getting by in life by the skin of his teeth, because he prioritizes helping the helpless over helping himself. This is Spider-Man. Also, not to mention, I really love the suit. And its strange silver tint on the blue lining, I don't know, it's just great. I just think it's great. Honestly, top 5 Spider-Man suits of all time for me. And I don't care what Channel Pup has to say. I also really enjoy the show's portrayal of Mary Jane. I think it's a lot more aligned with the Mary Jane from the comics. I mean, maybe not aesthetically, but in terms of characterization. It's a hell of a lot closer to Mary Jane than what they did in the Sam Raimi films. Sure, she falls into the damsel in distress trope a couple times, but at least this interpretation of the character, actually is a character. This show's Mary Jane reminds me of the Mary Jane I grew up reading. She's smart, she's confident, she's sarcastic, she's personable. She has this energy to her that makes sense that people would want to be around her. She's a small girl, but she has a personality 8 times her size. She's an interesting person who dances to the beat of her own drum. She's not just love interest. She's a character who has her own thoughts, ideas, feelings, goals, everything else. And Harry, well, Harry is different here. I don't think this is my ideal version of the character, but I will say I think that they did a good job of making him his own thing. This Harry is calm, cool, and collected. Unless something vaguely Spider-Man is brought up, at which point...
I've always hated Spider-Man. Idiots. They have no idea what he really is. Murderer.
Harry.
Anytime something goes wrong on the show, there's Harry to insist Spider-Man is somehow behind all of this. It was like watching a CGI rendition of a pup named Scooby-Doo. You know how Fred always is like, oh, it's gotta be Red Herring. It's Red Herring. That is Harry with Spider-Man in this show. Despite the fact that he got saved by Spider-Man on multiple occasions in the series, he still insists that Spider-Man is all that's wrong in the world. There was one interesting moment that looked like the character was developing and evolving and maybe their dynamic would change. Once Spider-Man saved his life for about like the 3rd or 4th time in the show, Harry actually extends his hand to help him up. But then the next episode, he's right back to hating him all over again. So there's been no progress made. When he's not making everything about Spider-Man, he's drinking to it. And drinking a lot. It's like the animators accidentally created the Harry model with a martini glass embedded into his hand at all times. No, seriously, he carries it around a lot. Like, I know they're supposed to be in college, but I don't even know if he's legal drinking age here. Can he be doing this? Should he be doing this? Should I be showing this? I'm not even sure. I guess it does fall in line with the Harry Osborn character, as every on-screen interpretation has been an alcoholic, and when he's not complaining about Spider-Man or getting polluted, he's spending his time with whoever the flavor of the week is. This Harry is somewhat of a ladies' man, and it's amazing how he does so well when there's so very little to like about him. In all seriousness, I actually do kind of like this Harry to a degree. Like I said, it's not the way that I would portray the character if I was the one creating the show, but it's good for a different interpretation. I just wish that there was a little bit more development with him. Like, I'm not saying take things the Gobby route, because I, for one, personally could never see this version of Harry Osborn becoming the Goblin. Just doesn't seem like the logical next step for him, but do something with him, please. I think this version of events does a great job of establishing the group of Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson, and Harry Osborn as a group of friends. And good friends at that. We never get that in the original films. Peter and Mary Jane only interact because they're neighbors. Harry is Peter's best friend. Harry is MJ's rebound after Flash. And then MJ dates Peter, and has limited interaction with Harry from that point on. In the original trilogy, the three never really become the friends that the ending to the 3rd movie seems to indicate. They don't really have all that much screen time together as a unit. But here, there's a very clear and a very believable friendship between all 3 of them. They're constantly supporting each other and trying to help each other out. There's an actual relationship and group dynamic here. And I don't know, it's just kind of pleasant to see them interact in their day-to-day lives like this. Because again, that's not something we got in the original movies.
Friends. Good ones.
Always.
I have a lot of mixed feelings on the Peter Parker-Mary Jane romance the show sets up. They're depicted as 2 close friends who have serious feelings for each other, but the 2 could never get the timing quite right. I like that interpretation of the relationship. And I even like a lot of the moments that we see between the 2 of them, and how we see them just barely missing each other, and the roadblocks that get in the way of them being an item. And despite obviously playing into the constant will they, won't they trope, I think my biggest issue with it here, though, is it's a non-issue. I just kind of feel like they're making their own drama here. The very first episode of the series shows some flirtatious conversations between the 2 and ends with them finally kissing. Then the next episode, Mary Jane questions if Peter even knows that she likes him. She starts dating some actor dude. They kiss again a few episodes later, but she's still dating the acting dude. And then she hooks up with Spider-Man later on, and then she's not with the acting dude. It's obvious that the two aren't an item, only because the writing insists upon it. Their will they or won't they comes off more like they will, and why aren't they already? I guess the introduction of Indy halfway through the series creates a potential natural wedge there, but, like, it really doesn't. Indy's introduced one episode, kisses Peter in front of MJ, breaks her heart, but then the very next episode there's no reference to that incident whatsoever. Mary Jane is still trying to woo Peter, and he's still going along with it as if Indy doesn't exist. It's like every episode, the slate gets wiped clean. The show was put together as a villain of the week type show, which is why the Lizard lives and dies in the span of 20 minutes, and why Electro needs 2 separate episodes to complete his full arc. In terms of continuity, despite being a little bit shackled to the first movie, it's not as held down by its own canon. Sometimes it feels like these episodes aired out of order. Characters are introduced and forgotten from one episode to the next. It's like every episode is a brand new reset. It's not the worst thing in the world, because I guess for the most part we're supposed to believe time passed in between episodes and maybe that has something to do with it, but still, sometimes it just comes off as a little bit jarring, especially if you're binge watching the series and watching these episodes back to back. Since the show aired on MTV, a lot of the cast was actually in fact popular artists of the time. Eve plays the Black Cat-inspired Talon. Rob Zombie plays the Lizard, and that is every bit as frightening as it sounds. And Lisa Loeb plays Mary Jane Watson. I think this was her first voice acting role too, and let me just tell you, she fucking nails it. The animation is incredible for its time. I really enjoyed the design of the characters and the look of the city. Sure, it doesn't really hold up by today's standards, but for the time, this was pretty impressive. Looking back on it now, yeah, it does feel a little bit limited. The characters' movements can sometimes feel a little bit awkward and stilty. The city can feel a little bit empty. And when it's not, it's apparently being taken over by shadow people? But I don't think that it's ugly to look at. And for animation made in 2002, yeah, highly impressive. Overall, after rewatching all of the show, I don't think that there's necessarily a bad episode in the bunch. Sure, there are some that are definitely better than others, but I can watch any one of these episodes and be thoroughly entertained. Unfortunately, despite high ratings, the show was canceled after its first season, lasting only 13 episodes. It was canceled mainly because MTV didn't feel like the show fit in with the rest of the channel's programming. And yeah, obviously it didn't, but if you have people tuning into your channel, who gives a damn, MTV? And see, mistakes like this are exactly why no one's watched MTV in the last 20 years. Personally, this is why I was a Fuse TV guy. Oh, that and Mistress Julia. Mistress Julia, god damn, what is she doing to... Where is she? Anyway, I think that canceling the show when they canceled it was a big mistake. The show's first and only season is really, really good. And I think it truly captured the essence of Spider-Man in a way that a lot of other Spider-Man shows just didn't. Sure, some of the stories feel like you're running through them at rapid speed. And there's definitely a changing of some plot details, character names, appearances, and overall demeanors. But I still think despite all of that, this show really understood the characters. And they understood the world of Spider-Man. Just watching the show makes me wonder what could have been. Because this was a strong starting point. And when you're at the beginning of a creative project, there's nowhere to go but up. This show started off strong. Who knows what they would have done had they allowed the series to continue? Had they gotten a second season? I, for one, would have loved to see characters like Mysterio, and Carnage, and Venom. Maybe even the Green Goblin again. I don't know. Sky's the limit.
Think about it!
This show is criminally underrated. It doesn't work as a sequel of any kind to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. Even when forgetting about the movie sequels, it just doesn't work as a follow-up. And trying to make a direct connection to the Tobey Maguire movie is probably the show at its lowest point. The link to the movie does more to hinder this than it does to help it. Because even as a kid, I never bought that this was taking place in the same universe. Everything is far too different for it to all be one and the same. But as its own unique take on the wall crawler, I think this succeeds on all levels. If you haven't already, I'd highly recommend tracking this down and giving it a watch. It is one of the, no hyperbole here, one of the best Spider-Man shows I have ever seen. And I had a friend come over here the other day to pick something up, and I had this show on the TV. And he wound up sitting down and watching the whole series with me because he was that invested in what he had seen. Seriously, this show, worth the watch. And that's even without mentioning that the theme song slaps. It's really unfortunate that, like many great things, this show was taken before its time. It's really upsetting that the show ended the way it did and when it did.
Not very satisfying, is it? She's dead, and I assure you nothing can bring her back.
Or is it?
Luckily, there are a few people out there trying to right this wrong, with their own fan-made follow-up to the series. And all the animations I'm showing you right now are from that very team. Now, the project is only in its early stages, obviously, so if you'd like to support this and be a part of the history that is currently being made here, well then all the information is available both in the description and in the comment section below. Feel free to donate, follow them on Twitter, spread the word, and help the new animated series continue on with its own Season 2. And I don't want to brag or anything here, but believe it or not, yours truly, the Prince of Personality himself, your least favorite YouTuber, has been cast in this project in 2 separate roles. And whoever could properly guess which 2 characters I'm playing in the comment section below gets a shout out in my next Spidey video. The rules are pretty simple. Everyone only gets 1 comment to guess, only 2 names to guess, and they have to get both characters correct in order to be shouted out. I guess essentially what I'm trying to say here is...
Everybody gets 1. Tell him, Peter.
Apparently everybody gets 1.
Bingo.
So with that being said, have at it. Head on over to those animators, to those producers, to those writers, and you let them know who sent you. This guy. I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank y'all for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.